Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Ready at Work, where we get to talk about racial equity and intersections in the workplace. Joining us today, we have Major Indira Thackorie, who I'm very pleased to introduce. After her return from Afghanistan, Indira worked as a communications advisor for the National Defense Public Affairs Office in Toronto, focusing on strategic engagement with key stakeholders in the military. It's such a pleasure to have you here today, Indira. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Born in San Fernando, Trinidad, Major Indira Thackorie moved to Canada at the age of 13. She joined the Canadian Armed Forces 4 years later through a co-op program in high school and reached the rank of sergeant before commissioning as an officer in 2008. Indira is a full-time reserve major in the Canadian Army in Ottawa, Ontario. After her return from Afghanistan, Indira worked as a communications advisor for the National Defense Public Affairs Office in Toronto, focusing on strategic engagement with key stakeholders for the military. These words would never come as authentic from my lips than to hear maybe your own journey and your experience. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
But you want to walk us through day one and just what the journey so far has been in the course of your time in the military?
Sure. I started when I was 17 through a co-op program in high school, as you said, and it wasn't something I was originally planning. As a first-generation immigrant to Canada, having only been in Canada at that time for, 6 years, it wasn't something I was originally planning. Anyway, I joined through a co-op program, which happened to be a fluke, and it was probably the best thing I've ever done. Being a soldier is the only thing I've ever known for 25 years. Lots of volunteer work, but really it's at the core of who I am. So I feel like some of the highlights of my career are very age specific. So, you know, when you're 17 to 20, you're really enjoying firing those weapons, driving those big trucks. And then you're in your 20s and I really enjoyed the travel. That's for sure. I really liked working with different militaries across the world. When I worked with the UN in Israel and with NATO in Afghanistan, I remember my first day in Kandahar after we got off the aircraft. They took us to get something to eat, and I walked into the dining facility, and there was just so many different types of uniforms and weapons. And I don't know, it was the first time I had seen that many, and it was a very, very cool experience. You know, getting to know how different nations work. Some of the other highlights would be being with the snowbirds, so traveling around North America, showcasing the professionalism and the dedication of CAF personnel, working with the parachute team, doing the exact same thing, having the opportunity to work on large-scale commemorative events, you know, representing Canada and France for the 100th anniversary of Vimy, 75th anniversary of Dieppe. Most importantly, I think the most prominent highlight of my career would definitely be the friendships and all the people I've met along the way, and those deeply rooted friendships that come from hardship that we've experienced together. And that's sort of sisterhood and brotherhood that we hear about a lot in movies and so on. So it's real, and I've enjoyed it for 25 years.
That's amazing. My own career hasn't spanned 25 years, but I can tell you for a fact that not too many people would be able to list all of the things that you just shared and just packed into, what was that, a minute or something? So well done. Kudos to you. Sounds like it's been a most remarkable journey in the past 25 years. You know, what having this conversation, and I'm thinking about an initial one that we had just around at the beginning with your mom, who, you know, I think she said she thought you were only going to be there for about 3 months. It was all child's play, right? Do you want to bring us back to that experience?
Well, in order to join the military at the age of 17, I needed my mother's permission. At the time, she thought I would only last 3 months, given my current or my temperament at the time, the fact that I had really long hair, who knows? Just not something she ever considered for her daughter, I suppose. When I finished my course, and I didn't know this, but I found out really only last year. She was telling a group of people at a speaking engagement that the reason why she had no problems with me continuing my journey in the military was because after the hardship she saw me endure during basic training, so the blisters on the feet and the back injuries and the asthma, I had a lot of asthma triggers because I have asthma. She said after all of that, she thought, this girl has worked really hard. You know, who am I to tell her she can't be in the military? Mm-hmm. So she was proud. And it's funny because when I look back at the experience of basic training, I don't remember the blisters. I don't remember the back injuries or any of that. I think back to my junior leadership course because I joined as a private in the infantry. I switched occupations 3 times in my career. 12 years was spent as a resource management support clerk. And then I switched to public affairs when I came back from Afghanistan. And when I look back, I don't remember any of the hardships. I only remember the good times and the cool stuff I've done. And it's honestly the reason why I've always wanted to work in recruiting, actually, because I feel like once you've accomplished unique things and in things that you didn't think you could accomplish before, when you look back, it's obviously with a sense of pride, and the bad stuff kind of doesn't really matter, but they exist.
That's amazing, Indira. Every time I hear you say it, it just brings me to a certain place, which would only be a dream for me now and always. But thank you very much for sharing that. You also did mention that in the course of your training and onboarding, if I could call it that, there were just 2 of you at the time who would identify as racialized. Do you find that happening more and more so in these times? Do you think there is an increase in the level of diversity? And where are those people now? I mean, everybody else that you got into the program with.
When I started my co-op program, there were 30 of us, and there were only 2 visible minorities, myself and my friend Mannion, that's right. Coincidentally, him and I are the only 2 left in the military from that group. Everybody else has either retired or they've switched careers. It was a reserve course, of course. So kind of on par with the attrition rates in the military, so to be expected. We have a representation rate of 16.9, so about 17% visible minorities in the military. We don't ever have a problem recruiting visible minorities, and I keep using that term because that's the term used in the Employment Equity Act as a representation rate. So in order for the military to represent the society that it serves, it has to reflect that society. And it's the reason why we have a goal, a representation goal of 25.1% for women, 16.9% for visible minorities, and I believe it's 2.8% for Indigenous. And this is all federally mandated. And we have been meeting our quotas, which I think is great, except for when it comes to the recruitment of women. We've found through research that we're just not meeting our quotas for a number of reasons. One of which is it's just not considered by women at a young age as an occupation that they want to get into. And that could be for a number of reasons. We'd have to talk about that in a whole other podcast because I could go into it forever. But yeah, basic training, the 2 of us are still left. I want to say it's because of a sense of huge pride as immigrants coming to Canada, serving that country that has taken you in and given you this life. I kind of still feel personally like I'm still earning all the privileges I have from being in Canada.
I'm really glad that you bring up the subject of privilege, because if there is anything that events in most recent times have really turned our attention and the attention of the world to, it's just around some of the inequities, inequalities, if you may, that exist, or privileges. Let's just get to that. And if we're talking about military, of course, we're talking about power and all of the dynamics around that that could sometimes be perceived as exclusionary, if not so in actual fact. What would you say? Are there some instances that you could point to around how those privileges or power dynamics within the military, around how there still needs to be some change?
Sure. In every organization, I would say, across Canada and the world, there's always room to grow and change and be better. With the military, it's the exact same. We admit that there are barriers and challenges that exist for women, visible minorities, And we're definitely working towards finding out what those are and addressing them. And it's going to be a really long time because culture change definitely takes a long time if research has told us anything. I personally have experienced more gender inequality in the military than I have any sort of racism or discrimination. I can't, and I was trying to think, and I was very fortunate I am very fortunate to be able to say I haven't experienced any sort of racial discrimination in the military, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We hear stories all the time. And in fact, we want to hear more. So this year, for the International Day of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we're launching a social media campaign where we're asking members of the defense team and all our stakeholders, pretty much everybody, to tell us about some of their lived experiences so that we can figure out exactly what the problem is and move the mark, address them in the best way that we can. So that it's the first step is admitting that that they still exist, barriers and challenges still exist. And I know there are people out there that don't think that. We all know that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Institutional racism, systemic inequalities are definitely a thing. And for us, members of different equity-seeking groups, this is definitely a day-to-day experience, much more than it would be for certain other groups who maybe are a bit more privileged or just have the power tilted in their favor.
I am fortunate to be working at the Directorate of Human Rights and Diversity, where I get to work with folks who are addressing some of the barriers and challenges that exist. The Anti-Racism Secretariat that was formed for the department last year, we recently in December started up a Department of National Defense advisory panel to address racism and discrimination within the department. Just last year in July, we released a new policy on hateful conduct, making it very clear to everybody in the organization that hateful conduct will not be tolerated whatsoever. So there was a clear definition of what that is and what the consequences were. And that was issued all across the board. So the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, everybody in the defense team, all the civilians, everybody now understands that that's a priority for us. It's a priority for the minister, it's a priority for the department. And then I like seeing some of the changes over the last 25 years, things like the Navy changing their ranks. So they're no longer called, ordinary seamen, they are now called sailors, which I think is fantastic.
Really great to hear about some of the work that's happening internally and grounds that the military needs to cover and is starting to cover. But what about the public perception? Just the lack of faith and trust in more recent times, not just in the military, but even in the police and other groups that are protecting and serving the larger public. How would you say the military is working towards ensuring that it keeps a good image and it stays really accountable to the communities and the society and the population that it serves?
I think it doesn't matter what organization you work for. With the current climate of the media and just the internet in general, the fact that everybody's a content creator, transparency is so imperative. And it is one of the foundations that we operate under, having to report to Canadians all the things that we're doing at all times, and not just what we do, but how we do it. And so transparency is really important to us. And so we're always trying to do our best to communicate, our policies, both internally and externally, trying to put our best foot forward. And of course, these things optically aren't always going to work out because we're all also humans. So there's the human factor. We know sexual misconduct exists in the military. We know racism exists everywhere. And though we have all these policies in place and where we've got these programs, Positive Space program, we did launch a program for our internal audience to be able to make themselves more aware about how to be more inclusive when it comes to the LGBTQ2+ community. And that's fantastic. But even though these things are available, there's always going to be people who either aren't going to want to take it unless it's mandated, right? We know this from being humans. But the good news is from a department perspective, that's all we can do is have the training available and then in some cases make it mandatory and make it clear to everybody that these things will not be tolerated. And so the accountability lies in letting everyone know that this is not going to be tolerated and that there will be consequences. So putting words to action. And I think we've seen some of that recently, which is great. So we have a Directorate of Military Personnel Research and Analysis, I believe they're called, DGMPRA, and they work with academia, other organizations in Canada to help us develop these programs. You know, we're going to reach out to the experts when we need to help us develop the programs that we have. And I don't necessarily work with those teams, so I can't speak to that too much. But what I do love about what I'm seeing as a member of the military is our push towards inclusion. You know, we talk about diversity and we know that diversity is a fact. You know, it's a numbers game, but inclusion has to be cultivated. And I'm liking that I'm seeing the push towards a more inclusive workforce with things like the Positive Space program, ambassador program, and the hateful conduct policy, and so on. So I know we're working on really pushing inclusion in the military to change behavior. And again, culture change takes time, but making sure we make it clear that we want, even though we have diversity in the military, we want to see people behave better, be better, you know, be more inclusive, and teaching people what that means. And one of the things is helping people identify what their unconscious biases are, because that's one of those things you don't necessarily know that you have until you have that uncomfortable conversation with someone. And so I think it's important that we all get really comfortable with having those really tough conversations to help us identify the things that we didn't even realize that we were doing or saying, these unconscious decisions that we make. And so the fact that the department has a push right now to help us identify unconscious bias, we're talking about it, we're trying to address racism by having conversations about what's happened to people. We're trying to bridge the gender equality divide by working on retention. So it's headed in a good direction, and I'm really happy to be part of it from sitting in the Directorate of Human Rights and Diversity.
It's good to see that there is some work that's happening at this time. It will be great to see more. It will be great to see more inclusion of different perspectives. In the course of your career in the military, at what point would you say work around data collection and making meaning and analysis of data, at what point would you say it started to gain traction, or is this a thing that just has always been?
I want to say it's always been, but from where I've worked before, I didn't really have privy to at what level we were using it. I know we have a department, Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis, and they're in charge of collecting and putting together all the reports, collecting the data, putting together the reports, which they're still doing now. Fantastic team. They do a ton of work, and they're the ones that inform our policies and our practices. And so we know that the data collection is occurring. We know the importance of disaggregated data because, of course, we want to make sure that we're getting that perspective for all of the groups that we're trying to have these policies before. So we know that it's important. We've been collecting it, even things as simple as marketing and advertising. All of the decisions made in marketing and advertising are based on the data we collect from the campaigns that we're running and the people that we're trying to reach and whether or not we're actually reaching them. So, and aside from, you know, informing policies, marketing, advertising, and you've got the communications arm of the military where all of our decisions are based on measuring whether or not we're being successful in our communications efforts as well. So I would say data is very important to the organization. We've been collecting it, I believe, for a very long time, and it exists. We're using it. We're trying to inform our policies. Of course, changing policies for such a large federal department does take some time.
Obviously, through the span of your career, there have been highs and lows, if we can call it that. But look, you're still standing, and it's been 25 strong years. So, wondering, for the sake of every and anyone who's listening, if there was a 17-year-old woman of color at this time who is considering a career in the military, what are some of the nuggets that you want to leave her with?
I would definitely tell that person to not just consider it, but do it. I would absolutely say that considering a career in the military is probably one of the best things I've ever done, if not the best thing I've ever done. Don't tell my husband I said that, because sometimes I tell him marrying him was the best thing I've done. Being a woman of color has never really been an issue for me in the military. I love that the organization itself prides itself on assessing everybody equally based on merit. And I love that I've had such adventures and I've had so many opportunities that are unique to the military, like being able to hang my feet outside the back of a Hercules aircraft while it was flying, or, you know, fly around in jets. And I've been on ships, I fired weapons. I mean, there's so many unique things that you could do in the military that you can't do anywhere else. It's an organization that is inclusive and striving to be even more inclusive, which I think is fantastic. And it's a career where at the end of it, you're going to have a pension. So, I mean, I'm trying to think of the lows of my military career, and there aren't very many. And I'm very fortunate to say that. Very, very fortunate to say that. So I would recommend it to anyone.
Absolutely, that's awesome. I remember in a different conversation that we had, you referring to your mom talking about she assumed you weren't gonna survive 3 months there because, you know, during your training, having to stand in the rain and all of that. And for you, it was, I remember in your words saying, that's not what you remembered. It was, maybe I should step away and just let you use your own words at this point to describe that experience.
22 years after I joined the military, she told me in front of a bunch of folks while I was giving a presentation, she was in the audience. And I said, hey mom, do you remember telling me that I wasn't gonna last 3 months in the military? And she said, yes, I remember that. And she also remembered at the end of basic training when she said she didn't have any problems with me staying in the military, because when she saw what I had been through, and she had tended to the bruises on my back from the equipment and tended to my feet from all the blisters, and if after all of that hardship I still wanted to stay, then she had no problems with me staying, because she couldn't have believed what I had accomplished. And I think it was a big deal because I had asthma, and I still was able to do everything even with asthma. It was a ton of work, but the rewards were incredible, and the highs were so high that I didn't even remember her tending to my back or the blisters on my feet, because when I look back in my career, those aren't the things I think of. You know, I only think of the things like sitting in the back of a Herc, or being on a ship, or firing all those weapons. Like, that's the stuff I think of, and the opportunities to travel that I've had. So I thought it was interesting that she brought that up, and that I didn't even think about the bad stuff.
And you're retiring in 14 months. What a way to look back on that experience. And what a way to also bring our conversation to a close today. Thank you for sharing from your wealth of experience. Thank you for literally taking us through this journey, both from a personal lived experience point of view, and also in tapping into some of the work, getting some understanding around some of the work that's happening within the military, larger military stratosphere, if we could call it that. Thank you so much for this, Indira. This has been great.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done, that you're continuing to do, will do, and for allowing me to be a part of it.
Awesome. We'll see you again sometime, and have a great day.
You too.
Yeah.